Hi, this is Jen the Liberty Lion, and today I want to talk to you about personal and private and the words being used by um, the various government entities that are really general words that cause people to believe that these words apply to them. So let's take the words personal and private, and you can also take the words individual, property, human, born, born alive, um, and a lot of other words that are written in their titles and acts that would cause someone to believe that those things apply to them. Okay, so I'm going to help you understand that those things do not apply to you, that they apply only to the people on those lands. There's a lot of things that we could add into this conversation, a lot of roads that we can go down that will help you understand what I'm getting at here. But I'm going to try to keep this clear and concise. It's difficult sometimes. So let's take personal and private. Um, Whenever you're on federal lands, the federal laws apply to you. Whenever you're off federal lands, they don't. Whenever you go to the state capital, there are laws that apply to you and there are laws that don't. What the federal and state governments like to do is try to get people to think or allow people to think that when they're not on those lands, that those laws still apply to them. And because people don't really understand situs, which is a situation, or lex situs, the law of the land, they don't understand that the laws that apply to them depend on where they sit or who they're doing business with. Who they're doing business with is a contract. And contracts can also be thought of as states. So states are not just a geographical boundary. States are also like situations. A state, a status, a situ, a situation. Okay, situs. So let's take personal. Personal is if I go to work for the federal government and they issue me a computer, they issue me a canteen to drink out of, they issue me a phone, they issue me an office space, they issue me a weapon. All those things are for my personal use, which means my individual use. They're not private property. I don't own them. I have to give them back either at the end of the day, at the end of the week, or before I terminate employment. Okay, so the same thing applies if I'm in the military. They issue you property for your personal use, which means individual use, and then you give it back when you're done. Now, private property is different. Private property, if I'm carrying a person driving my own car onto private property or onto federal lands, it's considered private property. A man's wallet is his private property. The clothes you're wearing is your private property. Your body is your private property. But when you go onto federal lands, you sort of give up the right to not be searched or not have things seized from you. Okay, so if you take um, like a like an ounce of cocaine or a bag of marijuana or whatever onto federal lands, they can search you at any time and then take that, even though it would sort of be your private property because the federal laws apply on the federal lands. What they like to do is pay police to apply the federal laws off federal lands. And when they say, well, we have a right to search and seize private property, well, they kind of don't because a federal law applies on federal lands. How do we know that? How do we know that for sure? How do we know that for a fact? Because we have something called cession laws. Cession laws are when a state joined the union, they designated certain lands inside their state to be used for federal purposes. The Constitution says that those purposes are for defense, for building forts, arsenals, docks, other needful buildings, and then for carrying out the things listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And then also you have the seat of government, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So you have people who go on to federal lands, and when they go on to federal lands, the federal laws apply. So not only did the state cede the lands to the federal government, but they also gave lawmaking power to the federal government. And those are shown in the session laws. Some states kept the right to go onto the federal lands to do things like issue summons, warrants, make arrests, some certain things. But they couldn't, no matter what, interfere with the constitutional things because it was already laid out in the Constitution. Okay, so the state gave up lawmaking power over the federal lands. And so the federal government gained the right to make law, rules, regulation over the federal lands. That's basically all the federal government has the power to do. There are a few other things in there like treaties and so on and so forth. Protect the Indians and their reservations, that kind of thing. And then it says no state shall interfere, blah, 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 blah. And it's talking about interfering with those federal military functions. Okay, so the federal government has to be able to do things. So let's talk about the word commerce. Commerce is another one of those general words. Everybody has commerce. Everybody wants commerce. Everybody does things and move things and transport things. But what is the federal Constitution talking about when it says states and commerce, when it talks about states and commerce in the federal government? And if you put everything into context, what it appears to be saying is that when the Constitution is enacted and there's like some war thing going on, or even in peace, the federal areas need to be able to move things back and forth, okay? In order to do that, the states have to agree not to interfere, okay? So one state cannot interfere with the movement of things from one military post in one state to another military post in another state. And they didn't want the states to be able to tax the federal government, to charge fees, to transport things off the state lands or into a different state land onto the federal posts. They wanted to be able to use the roads. And so that kind of stuff is in the Constitution as far as the federal government's right to be able to move things from the federal lands in a state to the seat of government, from the seat of government to another military post, from that military post into another state on another military post. Because everything moving is commerce. It's not necessarily related just to commercial things. But the federal government allowed the people on the federal lands to create businesses because they needed to supplement their income in some kind of way. And so they allowed them to use some of these public federal lands to do ranching and farming and that kind of thing. And that way they could move cattle, they could move produce, they could move arms, they could move letters, correspondence from one military post in, let's say, Virginia to a military post in Ohio. So they could use the state roads and they could move their stuff around, okay, all over. And during war, this is particularly essential because you have to be able to move troops, you have to be able to move equipment, you have to be able to move people, You have to be able to move supplies. And if there's a state interfering, then you've got a problem. You're going to have to go around into another state and around the state. And that's why it was important for the whole country, all the states in the country, to join the union so that they were stronger together and that there would be no hindrance in protecting all the states. So if you're in, let's say, Virginia, and you need to go to Nevada, and you're a military person and you're moving supplies, you don't have to go all the way up and around Kansas, because Kansas is not part of the union, to get to Nevada to drop off supplies or correspondence or equipment or troops or what have you. So no state shall interfere, no state shall impede, all these things. And what they've done is they've gone and they've expanded that idea and allowed people or enticed people or propagandized people into believing that the federal government has control over the commerce of the state. And I don't believe that's what was intended by the Constitution. Okay, so the federal government was allowed to tax. So when people say, oh, the title says personal, the title says private property, the title says individual, the titles talk about human beings and born alive, it's not talking about everybody in the country. Even when it says state, it's not talking about the states that we, in the way we think of them, because there are a lot of different ways to apply the word state. Okay, so no state shall interfere means of any state, all the states created in your mind, the legal state, the state created by people having a geographical boundary, the states created by the federal government, all these things. There's different types of states. So we have to be able to put into context what the federal government has authority and jurisdiction over and what they don't. And then we apply what did they mean by that when they say state? What do they mean by that when they say personal property? What do they mean by that when they say private property? So when you have agents working for the federal government, or any kind of employee or military person working for the federal government, telling you when you're not on federal lands that they have a right to confiscate your private property, your personal property. They have a right over human beings. They have lawmaking power over this, that, and the other. They're not lying. It's just that they're in the wrong place. They're off federal lands when they're supposed to be. If they're applying federal laws, they're supposed to be on federal lands. They're supposed to be applying those laws to the people on the federal lands. Okay, and the state is supposed to protect us from the federal government, and it's supposed to protect us from itself, and we're supposed to protect ourselves from the federal government and the state by knowing our rights. Another way that they try to lie to us, propagandize to us, and get us in under their jurisdiction is by creating these instrumentalities which have no federal authority, and getting us to sign contracts with them. Now, I know for a fact that these contracts are not in compliance with federal laws because they don't have a positive law citation, and they don't, they require you to sign it. If I commit a crime on federal lands, they're not going to ask me to sign anything. I'm already on federal lands. So if I commit a crime on federal lands, then I'm under the federal law. If I'm off federal lands and a federal agent comes and says you committed a federal crime, it must be because I have a license with one of its instrumentalities, and the instrumentality has an agreement with the federal government to use federal agents against citizens, not part of the federal government, who signed contracts. So, for a fact, these contracts do not comply with the ideas of federalism because there's a process for handling, creating, and using forms. So the W-4 has to go through a process and update it every so many years in order to be used. And during this process, they have to state whether or not the form complies with the ideas of federalism. Many of the forms do not comply with the ideas of federalism. Now, federal people on federal lands are supposed to pay federal taxes. So the form can comply with the ideas of federalism when it's applied to the federal people who are the federal taxpayers, or the states who are federal taxpayers. But they don't necessarily apply to civilians not on federal lands, not working for the federal government. But the instrumentality, like the IRS, if you ask them, well, hey, why are you taxing me? They'll say, well, Congress has given us the right to do this. But Congress can't give the IRS a right that Congress doesn't have. So the IRS really always had the right to make contracts as a private entity. That's why they are, like the Federal Reserve Bank is a public-private entity. So when it uses the federal forms for people not on federal lands, it's a contract. It's just a contract. When they use the federal forms to people on federal lands, it's an obligation because they're obligated to pay taxes. And then you have the issue of whether or not taxes on wages is constitutional, because it doesn't say that, the Constitution doesn't say that the federal government has a right to tax wages. It says taxes, impost, excise, so on and so forth. So it doesn't really define taxes. But in some of the early laws, they had a right to tax the added income that officers made from the use of federal lands. So if it's, let's say it's 1800, and an officer joins, a man of the state joins the Union and becomes an officer, and the president as commander-in-chief signs his commission, then he has to move onto the federal lands and live there. And as he's living there, he might say, well, I'm not making enough money to feed my family, so I'm going to ask if I can work some of these lands, these extra lands over here that belong to the federal government that's not being used. And the federal government would give him permission. And today this looks like, if you're in the military and you're working for the military, you have to ask if you want to go off post and get a job, and they have to make sure that you understand that that job's not going to interfere with your federal job or be of any kind of conflict of interest. So if a federal officer is on federal lands and wants to use some of the public lands for farming or ranching, he has to pay a tax, which is a portion of the yield, which is like a lease payment or a rent payment. And that's the same way it was back in the Roman days, where Caesar would allow poor people to work some of the common lands, and that way they wouldn't be poor and they could work and they could contribute to society, but in turn they had to pay a rent. And so instead of saying you have to pay let's just say 10 coins a year, it was a portion of the yield. Because I think the reason why they did that was because they knew that weather conditions and people get sick in life, and sometimes they just can't produce what they would like to produce. And so it would defeat the purpose of trying to help poor people when they're taxed an amount that they can't pay. Then you've done nothing. You've just kept them poor, and there's no benefit to society in that. So what they would do is they would say you have to pay a portion of your yield. Whatever you yield, you have to pay back like 2% or something. And that was the tax, and that was the price of the lease. It was also more fair because instead of saying, well, you get an acre of land and you have to pay 2 coins a month, and he's got 10 acres of land and he pays 2 coins a month, that's not fair. He can produce more on his land than I can on my land. So it was like a portion of the yield, which is like a percentage that goes back to the government. And that's where the tax came in. And that is the same sort of situation, the same sort of process for taxation that is meant in the Constitution. So when a man decides he wants to become an officer, he leaves the state and joins the federal government as a citizen of the United States. He moves himself and maybe his family onto the federal lands, and he becomes a commissioned officer. He receives his commission, and then he's issued a home for his personal use in which he can put in his private property as an individual, as a human being, with private rights to do certain things. And let's say he gets there and he's like, well, I've got some extra time. I should do some farming or some ranching, or I want to raise cattle or horses or whatever. And he's got to use, because back in those days, let's say 1800, they were confined to the federal lands. They weren't allowed off the federal lands. They weren't allowed to use state services. They weren't allowed to use the public schools and the hospitals and the asylums and all those things. That was separate because the federal people paid federal tax and the state people paid state tax. Come about 1868, during the Civil War, all that changed when Lincoln decided that federal people were also state people. So federal people would pay federal taxes and state taxes, but then they could come off the federal post and use the state services like the schools. So if the federal officer needed extra income and he was using the federal public lands to generate that income, he would pay his tax as a portion of his yield. Okay, so why is it that people not on federal lands, not part of the federal government, required to pay federal taxes? And it's usually because we're doing business with, or we're working for or with some business or corporation that has registered itself as doing business with the federal government, Lex Citus, Washington, D.C. So under the laws of Washington, D.C. And it's just, the terms have been so general that, and vague, that everybody thinks it just applies to them because I'm a human. I have personal property, I have private property, I have private rights, I'm an individual, I have, all these papers and licenses and stuff, which are really just contracts and legal names to do legal business with the legal state, which is not really a state at all. It's a trick. Constitutional Law is Fiction by LaRue. He kind of goes into some of this stuff. Constitutional Law is Fiction, Narrative and the Rhetoric of Authority by LaRue. He's an attorney. I talked about this book. I bought it used, but it's probably on archive. And he talks about how he became an attorney and he went to work in New Orleans, and that the people there started educating him, and he was smart and he listened, and he was smart and he was thinking critically, and he realized that what he was taught in law school wasn't exactly right. And he became more aware, and he realized that the things that he thought were true and the things that he was taught in law school wasn't exactly so. And so it opened his eye, okay, his like third eye, his focus, his critical thinking, his common sense came and started working. And he realized that a lot of what we believe is true is not true. And it's not true because of the stories that these judges tell. For one reason why are these stories that the judges tell in their case laws, in their opinions, in their court opinions. Okay, so a lot of these words that we think apply to us don't apply to us, and they don't apply to us because we're not in that place where they apply. So you have to think about, where do the laws apply? Where do they apply? The lex situs, the law of the land. Lex situs is law of the land. Okay, people say the law of the land is the whole country and it comes from Washington. That's not true, because if it were true, why would we need states? We wouldn't need states. That's dumb. It's just redundant. One thing I think people from those times realized was that redundancy was fruitless and useful and a waste of time, and they knew that they didn't have a lot of time to spare. They were dead by the time they were in their 40s or 50s if they were lucky. So redundancy was something that they didn't have time for. That's just my opinion. That's what it looks like to me. So when you see these things, or these people come to you and they say, well, the federal government has a right over private property, personal property, individuals, every individual has to do this, you have to go back and apply it to where do they have a right. It's not just who, it's not just what words, it's where. It always comes down to where. And food for thought, the Federal Reserve Bank is not sitting on federal lands. It's sitting on private property. Okay? It's private property. I believe the head Federal Reserve Bank is on Manhattan Island, right? In a building owned by Rockefeller. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the bell notification. As I get settled into my new schedule with my daughter, she's got a couple of horses now, and so we are going and helping her with her horses for several hours, early morning to just before noon. So I'm trying to get used to this new schedule and everything going on, and so I'm getting used to it, and I'm trying to put out more videos. And I hope to do some videos sort of outside. So I just think it would be a nice background, nice thing to look at, being outside and stuff. So again, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment in the comment section. I hope that you got a little something out of this video, and stick around because I plan on doing more, and I'll see you in the next video.